Say it again, were the first words Mason Grant had spoken in 3 years. And almost no one heard them, because the moment they left his mouth, his grandmother slammed her hand on the table hard enough to bury his voice. 5 specialists sat in a half circle in the Grant Estate playroom. An AI-integrated sensory board, noise-canceling headphones calibrated to Mason's profile, a neural response monitor clipped to the boy's left wrist. 45 minutes in, same result as all 11 sessions before it. Mason Grant, 7 years old, sat cross-legged on the center rug with his mother's old stuffed bear against his chest, eyes open and entirely absent. Lucas Grant stood at the back, gripping a whiskey glass hard enough that a thin crack had begun working its way up through the crystal. He hadn't noticed, watching his son, with the look of a father who had spent 3 years paying experts, changing routines, blaming himself, and still failing to reach him. Mason. Just one word. Mason didn't look up. In the far corner, Amelia Foster was on her knees by the baseboard with a microfiber cloth, working on a water spill from the previous session. 30 years old, hair pulled back, temporary housekeeper, called in to clean the spill, then gone. A detail in this room. Nothing more. When Mason exhaled, that short, uneven breath at the edge of panic, Amelia's hands went still. She had heard that sound before, in a different room, from a different person, during an emergency that lasted 4 years and ended badly. Without deciding to, she hummed. 4 bars, no louder than breathing. The opening phrase of a melody she had built at her brother Daniel's bedside, a song she had never named and never sung anywhere else. Mason's head turned. First voluntary movement in 45 minutes. The neural monitor registered a shift. Dr. Ewan looked at her screen, then at Mason, then at Amelia. Mason's eyes found Amelia. The blankness shifted. Not recognition, but something older, a pull that preceded language, then barely above silence. Say it again. The words almost dissolved before landing, but they landed. Lucas heard them. The crack in the glass ran further. He took 1 step forward and stopped. Dr. Ewan rose and stepped between Mason and Amelia, hand raised slightly. Amelia was interrupting a clinical environment. Step back. Amelia began to rise, preparing to apologize and disappear, when Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, who had been standing near the doorway since the session began, crossed the room, before Lucas could ask his son to repeat it. She took in the room in one pass, her grandson on the rug, the specialists, her son frozen near the wall, the housekeeper with the cleaning cloth. She crossed to the table by the window, opened the drawer, removed a slim envelope, and set it on the floor in front of Amelia. Unhurried, deliberate. That's double your weekly rate. Take it, and forget what just happened. This isn't your concern. Amelia looked at the envelope, then at the floor. She didn't touch the money. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. She started toward the door, then small fingers catching the hem of a sleeve. Mason had reached out, 4 fingers around the cuff of her uniform, not toward his father, not toward any specialist, toward the woman with the cleaning cloth. He wasn't letting go. Mrs. Hargrove raised her hand and brought it flat down on the table. The crack of it filled the room, sharp enough that the therapists flinched, sharp enough to swallow the thin thread of whatever the boy had said. No one would acknowledge, in the hours that followed, what Mason had whispered. To do so would have meant explaining why their combined decades of expertise had produced nothing. And a woman on her knees with a cleaning cloth had. Lucas stood at the back of the room, looking at his son's hand around the sleeve of the woman his entire household had just agreed to treat as invisible. The crack in the whiskey glass ran a little further. He didn't notice. Mrs. Hargrove didn't ask Amelia to leave immediately. That would have required acknowledging that something significant had happened. She restructured instead. Before noon, a meeting in the main sitting room. Lucas, Vanessa Croft, the lead therapist. The therapist had already packed and left without comment. None mentioned what Mason had said. The agreed-upon version of the morning was that nothing medically significant had occurred. Amelia understood this without being told, from watching Who Looked at Whom. Mrs. Hargrove announced Amelia was restricted to lower floor cleaning only. No approach to Mason's room, no humming or singing near his corridor without explicit authorization. Vanessa was assigned to document any deviation. Lucas didn't publicly defend Amelia. He also didn't agree to her removal. He left the room before anyone could press him. When Amelia walked out of the playroom for the last time that morning, Mason was at the edge of the doorway. He watched. When she reached the staircase and glanced back, his eyes were on her with the focused attention of a child who has decided a particular thing matters enormously and is afraid it's about to disappear. That afternoon, her route to the linen closet passed the hallway adjacent to Mason's room. A presence on the other side of the door, not a sound, just the weight of attention. He was there, behind the gap in the doorframe, waiting for the 4 bars she was no longer allowed to sing. She kept walking. And as she turned the corner, something surfaced. A hospital room smaller than this hallway. A ventilator cycling down by degrees. Daniel's hand finding hers in the dark. His voice thinning to almost nothing. Sing it again. She had sung it. She had kept singing until there was no one left who needed her to. She kept walking. That night, just past 2, she heard it. A rhythmic, flat impact from the upper corridor. A small hand against the interior of a door. Steady, not panicked. A signal. She lay still for 30 seconds. Then she got up. Vanessa was already in the corridor, speaking through the door in measured protocol that wasn't working. Mason's breathing was audible from 10 feet, rapid, shallow, locked inside a memory he couldn't leave. When Vanessa tried the handle, Mason produced a short, wordless sound, and the silence after it was worse. Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the far end in a dressing robe, phone out. "Get Dr. Reeves. He may need something to help him settle." Amelia sat on the floor outside Mason's door, back against the wall. She hummed. The first 4 bars, then the next, through to the end. Slow, even. No urgency. The impact sounds stopped inside 15 seconds. The breathing slowed in stages, unevenly, a tide going out. 4 minutes, then 5. A soft, sliding weight crossed the floor on the other side and settled directly opposite her. 2 silhouettes in the light beneath the door, aligned. Amelia kept humming. She thought about sitting on linoleum outside Daniel's room at the care facility, nights they wouldn't let her stay inside. How she'd learned a sound doesn't have to enter a room to reach the person in it. She hadn't noticed the corridor was no longer empty. Lucas stood at the far end, watching Mason's shadow align itself with hers, without being asked. Before she stood to leave, the door opened just an inch. Mason's small hand reached out, not for her hand, but for the pocket of her apron. He slipped a folded piece of paper inside, then pulled back before Vanessa could see. Vanessa opened her blue notebook and wrote down the time. In his office, Lucas pulled up the security system and scrolled to 2:13 a.m. He watched Amelia arrive, hum, and Mason's shadow move from the center of his room to the base of the door, inch by inch, drawn toward the sound. His son choosing, freely and in the dark, to be close to someone. He watched it through once, then again, then a third time. He wasn't looking for anything new. He already knew what was in it. The meeting the next morning had the shape of a disciplinary hearing. Vanessa was already at the kitchen table when Amelia came downstairs, the blue notebook open to a fresh page. Mrs. Hargrove stood near the window. On the table, a behavioral contract Vanessa had drafted during the night. Unauthorized entry to the upper floor at 2:09 a.m. Contact with the minor without authorization. Unsupervised, undocumented. Sign this, and the matter is closed. One more violation, and your agency contract is voided. You won't work in this household or any associated property again. Amelia thought about the outstanding balance on Daniel's final hospitalization. $17,000. $200 monthly payments for 2 years and 4 months. She picked up the pen. Lucas walked in. He took in the arrangement and looked at Vanessa. What time did Mason fall back asleep last night? Close to 3. It took a while. Amelia said quietly. 2:24. Lucas had watched the footage. He knew exactly what time Mason's shadow had stopped moving. He picked up the contract and said he needed more time before any personnel decisions were made. Mrs. Hargrove's jaw tightened. She didn't argue directly, not in front of Vanessa, but the temperature in the room dropped, and everyone understood this wasn't finished. Celeste arrived that same morning, a nanny in her mid-40s, references from 3 prominent families, a professional file that made Amelia's 2 unfinished years look like a draft of something that never became real. She followed every protocol, organized Mason's afternoon schedule within 2 hours. Mason didn't look at her once. Just before 2 o'clock, a delivery van at the service gate held down its horn. 1 long note, then 2 short ones. Mason was in the library. By the time the echo died, he was under the table, knees to his chest, both hands over his ears, mouth open in a silent scream that was worse than any audible one. Celeste went in first. Measured voice, trauma-informed language, laminated emotion cards. Dr. Ewan tried the headphone anchor. Vanessa attempted eye contact. All of it correct. None of it working. Mason shook harder. Lucas stood in the library doorway watching 5 adults fail to reach his son. Then he turned and looked at Amelia, behind him with a stack of freshly laundered linens. He didn't speak. He stepped to one side. Amelia set the linens down. She sat on the floor just outside the library threshold, not entering, giving Mason the whole room. She hummed. Same 4 bars, same pace. 40 seconds. A minute. The shaking slowed in stages. Mason's head turned. He moved across the floor, low and slow, until he reached the threshold. He put 2 fingers on the fabric of Amelia's trousers and kept them there. Song. Lucas heard it from 3 feet away. When the room had emptied, he stayed. After a long moment, where did you learn it? That melody. I used to sing it for my brother. She said nothing more. He didn't push. He nodded once and looked at Mason, asleep against the wall, fingers still resting near Amelia's knee. Later, alone in the service wing, Amelia opened the folded paper from Mason's apron pocket delivery the night before. No words, just marks. Curves, dots, short, jagged lines in repeating clusters. She opened her notebook and began writing beneath each cluster what she heard in them: intervals, durations, the shape of a phrase trying to become music. Mason had been composing. In his own alphabet, without anyone teaching him this was something a person could do. He had been writing the song back to her. Celeste was very good at her job, professional in every measurable way, thorough, adaptable. Mason answered none of her prompts and sat through her sessions with the polite, patient absence of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. When Amelia walked past the hallway near the playroom, her natural route to the linen closet, Mason's eyes tracked her, quietly, consistently. Celeste noticed and said nothing. Vanessa noticed and wrote it down. Mrs. Hargrove noticed and began treating it as deliberate on Amelia's part. Vanessa started talking in the kitchen, never to Amelia, never anything directly challengeable. Positioning, making herself indispensable, taking calculated advantage of a grieving child's vulnerability. Amelia heard it. She said nothing and added tasks to her lower floor schedule instead. She told no one about the pieces of paper accumulating in her notebook. Mason had developed a system. When Amelia passed near the playroom with her mop and bucket, he found a way, through a gap in the door, through the moment when Vanessa's attention shifted, to press something into her apron pocket. 3 dots and a curved line. A bear beside a circle that was a moon. A wavy line beneath them like a musical staff. 2 marks repeated 4 times with a longer mark at the end like a rest. She kept them in order and showed them to no one. One afternoon, she crouched to retrieve a dropped cloth, and a paper slipped from her pocket onto the floor. Lucas, coming down the corridor with his phone, stopped. He looked at the marks, then at Amelia. He said nothing, but she saw his expression shift in a way that told her a piece of information had just slotted into a question he had been carrying. That same week, Lucas brought home a storage box of Claire's things: photographs, handwritten music scores, numbered cassette tapes, a small keyboard in bubble wrap, Mason's old toys, a painted wooden truck, magnetic letters, a stuffed rabbit with its ear repaired in mismatched thread. He set it on the dining room table and called for Mason. Mason looked at the photographs without reaching for them. When Lucas pressed play on cassette number 4, a number in marker, no other label, the first 7 seconds were road noise and wind. At the 8-second mark, a horn. Mason went white. He slid sideways off his chair and sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, eyes gone somewhere no one else could follow. Amelia was passing the doorway. She stopped. I don't think it's the accident he's reliving. I think it's the moment just before. The sound that came first. Lucas turned and looked at her. I wasn't in the car, he said. And before he could decide not to, I was supposed to be. Amelia absorbed that without filling the silence. She had carried a version of that weight herself for 4 years. I know what it's like to feel like the wrong person stayed. She didn't elaborate. Neither did he. Because Amelia was now being considered for limited supervised contact with Mason, Lucas requested her full agency file. Certificate in Early Childhood Music Education, Northeastern. Withdrawn, 2nd year. He called the program administrator. Family medical reasons, not academic. That evening, in the corridor outside the kitchen. You were 2 years into a music degree. Why did you leave? Someone needed me more than the degree did. She didn't say who. That night, he stood in the corridor, watching the monitor feed. His son sleeping without thrashing, without the sudden, rigid moments that meant the nightmare had taken him. and from down the hall, barely audible, the 4 opening bars of a melody that had become the sound he associated with his son being at rest. In the east wing, Mrs. Hargrove sat with her phone face down in her lap. She made 2 calls. The first was brief. The second was not. Mrs. Hargrove had requested an estate inventory, and Amelia had been assigned the secondary storage room specifically, away from the upper floors, away from the hallways, away from Mason. She worked left to right, shelf by shelf. At the back of the 3rd shelf from the bottom, behind board games whose boxes had begun to buckle, she found a shoebox. A strip of masking tape ran across the lid. The handwriting faded nearly to nothing. For Mason. And a second word that might have been bedtime. She assumed craft supplies. She opened it. Inside, 3 unlabeled cassette tapes, a small photograph of a young woman at an upright piano, a folded sheet of handwritten musical notation. The old cassette player sat on the shelf above, same model as the one in the dining room. She pressed play without expectation. Static, then a piano. Amelia's hands stopped moving. 4 bars in, she recognized it. The opening intervals were different, the tempo slower, but the core, the weight of the 3rd and 4th bars, the interval she had arrived at during a night in October 4 years ago when Daniel was frightened and she had needed something to give him. That was hers. That was the song she had built note by note in a hospital room in Medford, in a notebook no one else had seen. She pulled out her own notebook. The 2 melodies diverged at bar 7. Before that, the same piece of music. She was still on the floor with both notebooks open when she realized the doorway was no longer empty. Mason stood at the threshold. She didn't know how he'd gotten past Vanessa. His eyes were on the cassette player, his mother's bear in his left hand, his right hand open at his side. Amelia began to sing, bar 1 through bar 6, the shared bars, then her own version through to the end. Mason walked into the room and stopped directly in front of her, right hand still open, fingers slightly spread. Mommy sung, "Say it again." Clearer than he had spoken before, each word deliberate. Lucas was in the corridor. He had heard the cassette player from the hallway. He stood in the doorway looking at his son, at the woman on the floor with 2 notebooks in her lap, at the shoebox with the faded label he recognized immediately. He had watched Claire write it on a Saturday afternoon during her 2nd trimester at the kitchen table. Those tapes had been made over 3 weekends. He hadn't known they were still in the house. The melody Amelia had been singing in this house shared 6 bars with a recording made by a woman dead for 3 years. A woman Amelia had never met, whose name she hadn't been told, whose music she could not have found through any ordinary means. "Where did you get it?" Amelia looked up. She understood from his face that an accusation was forming. "I wrote it, a little at a time, over 4 years. I was taking care of my brother." She held up her own notebook, first dated entries from years before she had ever heard of Lucas Grant. He took it and turned through the pages, faded ink, hospital names in the margins, dates that couldn't be falsified in any way that would survive scrutiny. He had no clean explanation for what he was holding. Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. "A housekeeper who just happens to know our family's private lullaby. Don't you find that convenient?" Vanessa, behind her. "She's had access to the family's private storage. Multiple times. Alone." Celeste said nothing. Her eyes moved between Amelia and Lucas with the recalibration of someone who had assumed a simple situation and was no longer certain. On the floor between them, Mason pressed a folded piece of paper into Amelia's palm. A new one, different from the others. Her fingers closed around it without looking. Lucas stood with his wife's recording playing behind him and a stranger's notebook in his hands. His son had just spoken the clearest sentence he'd managed in 3 years. And he was afraid, not of Amelia, but of what it would mean if everything he had witnessed this past week was exactly what it appeared to be. Mrs. Hargrove worked over 48 hours, and she was precise. She and Vanessa reviewed the storage room footage together. What they kept? Amelia holding a family cassette tape, playing it, singing, Mason responding. What they cut? The 17 seconds showing Amelia discovering the shoebox while sorting inventory, reading the faded label with uncertainty, pressing play with the idle curiosity of someone who has no idea what she's about to hear. Without those 17 seconds, the footage told a different story. A woman who had sought out a private family recording, used a dead mother's melody to manipulate a traumatized child, positioned herself at the center of his response. Then, Howard Enfield called Lucas on Saturday morning. The call was framed as a check-in. The content was precise. If it became public that the CEO of a child safety education company had allowed an unqualified domestic employee to conduct unauthorized interventions with his traumatized son, the consequences could be significant and fast-moving. Lucas understood the call had not originated with Enfield. By Sunday evening, 2 weights sat on opposite sides of a scale: his son's well-being, the company's integrity. The edited footage pressed down hard on the second. He watched it twice. He didn't ask about the timestamp. He didn't look for the cut. He called Amelia into the main sitting room. Vanessa was there. Celeste was there. 2 household staff stood near the wall. A room arranged the way rooms are arranged when a message needs witnesses. Amelia kept her voice even and said what was true. She had found the tape by accident, hadn't known it belonged to Mason's mother, hadn't been looking for it. Lucas looked at her while she spoke, with the expression of a man who has already decided and is listening to confirm the decision is uncomfortable. You were in a restricted area with my son and my family's private recordings. I don't know whether you planned it. What I know is that you've used Mason's attachment to you to make yourself indispensable in this house. That ends tonight. The words landed exactly where she had spent 30 years building a wall. Being accused of using grief as a ladder, of treating a child's pain as a means. She stood still, holding the notebook. She had brought it thinking the dated pages might still matter. Lucas crossed the room and took it. He turned to the recent pages, her handwriting and Mason's symbol marks overlapping, the shared language they had been quietly building, and pulled those pages out, dropped them, pushed them across the floor toward the recycling bin with the side of his shoe. Don't bring that near my son again. He didn't know the notebook in his hands was the one she had carried through 4 years of her brother's illness, that some of the handwriting in the margins was Daniel's, words she had transcribed when speech became difficult, written down so she wouldn't forget. That the song on those pages was the last thing her brother ever heard. She found out later that Mason had been at the top of the stairs, that he had watched the pages fall, that it was the sound of them hitting the floor that made him scream. No more song! Sharp and broken from above. Mrs. Hargrove was up the staircase immediately, gathering Mason, one hand over his eyes, turning him away. His arms reached past her anyway, both of them straining toward the room below, toward Amelia still standing in the center of it. His hands kept reaching as he was carried back, even as the door closed. Lucas looked at her as if the decision had already hardened inside him. Pack your things tonight. You leave this house before morning." She packed. She took the notebook. The torn pages gathered from the floor, the original pages with Daniel's words in the margins. She did not touch the original pages from Daniel's final years. Those stayed intact, pressed under her palm like the last proof that someone had once needed her. She tore out only the copies she had made of Mason's symbols and left them in the bin. She wrote one sentence on a scrap torn from the bottom of a blank page and slipped it under Mason's door on her way out for the last time. "You don't have to speak to be worth loving." She left without collecting the final week of her pay. 11 blocks to the bus stop in the cold. She didn't cry until the bus came, quietly, face turned toward the dark window, in the practiced way of someone with a great deal of experience with it. In the Grant estate, Mason didn't eat, didn't sleep. He placed his mother's bear on the windowsill facing outward, which he had never done. The note stayed on the floor where she had left it, not because he didn't want it, but because picking it up would have meant the night was over. At 1:47 a.m., Lucas was in his office running the footage again. The timestamp read 11:09:42, then 11:10:00. 18 seconds. Gone. He went to the secondary backup system and found the raw file. Watched the 17 remove seconds. Amelia finding a shoebox while sorting inventory, reading the faded label with uncertainty, pressing play without expectation, going still, pulling out her own notebook and comparing. Her hands open in her lap, the cassette player still running. He scrolled to the preserved clip. Mason arriving in the doorway on his own, drawn by sound. Then the overnight footage. Mason at 3:22 a.m., face turned into his pillow. "Amelia, Mommy's song." A whisper, clear enough to catch on the room monitor. Lucas put his face in his hands. He had done this before. Stood in a different room, on a different night, and chosen the version of events that cost him less in the moment. He knew what that kind of choice had already taken from him. He was looking at what it had just taken again. The Sunday gathering had been on the calendar for 3 weeks. A quarterly family and board dinner. 11 people at the table. 2 of Lucas's cousins, 3 board members including Howard Enfield, Celeste, Vanessa, the estate's operations director, and Mrs. Hargrove at the far end. She opened with a prepared statement. An unnamed temporary employee. Violations of professional boundaries. Unauthorized contact with a vulnerable minor. Liability risk. Emotional manipulation of a child in fragile recovery. Enfield nodded at 2 points. One of Lucas's cousins looked at her hands. No one spoke in Amelia's defense because Amelia was not in the room, except that she was on her way. Lucas had driven to Somerville the day before, alone, and stood at the street entrance of her building and waited. He didn't begin with the apology. He brought instead an envelope. Mason's drawings, produced every day since she left in a small pile on the kitchen counter that no one had touched because Mason had made clear, without words, the pile was not for them. Amelia opened it on the front step. "He's been continuing the song," she said. She came Sunday evening not to argue her case. Mason had slipped his sketchbook into her overnight bag when she was packing. She'd found it on the bus, reaching for her phone and closing around the familiar cardboard cover, and she wanted to return it. When she appeared in the entrance to the dining room, the conversation stopped. She doesn't belong here. She was dismissed for cause. She is a cleaning woman who overstepped her authority and used a traumatized child to do it. No one pushed back. "She's here because I asked her to come," Lucas said. He turned the laptop to face the room and pressed play on the raw file. Unedited. 17 seconds restored. The room watched Amelia find the shoebox while sorting inventory. Press play on an old cassette machine. Go still when the melody began. Compare it against her own notebook with the expression of someone who cannot explain what they are hearing. Then he played the edited version and let it run until the timestamp jump was visible. 11:09:42 to 11:10. Enfield leaned forward. Lucas's cousin set down her wine glass and didn't pick it up again. Vanessa's color left her face, Mrs. Hargrove began. Context. Perspective. Managing a difficult domestic situation. And Lucas said, "Stop." In 64 years, her son had never said that word to her in a room full of people. "You altered evidence to have someone removed from my house, someone who was helping my son. You had Vanessa doctor footage, used a board member to deliver a message I was supposed to think came from the board, and put money on the floor in front of a woman whose only violation was making Mason feel safe. That is not protection. Protection would have been letting me see the truth." A sound on the stairs. Mason stood at the bottom in his pajamas, bare under one arm, a folded piece of paper in both hands. He had heard the tone of the voices and come down one step at a time on his own. He walked to his father and held the paper up. Lucas unfolded it. A crayon drawing. A woman at the center, a moon above her, musical marks radiating from her hands. To the left, Mason, his hand extended toward those marks. Between them, a larger, solid shape. No face. Blocking. In the margin, in the block letters Mason had been practicing alone, "She made me feel safe." Lucas looked up. Amelia was still in the doorway, holding Mason's sketchbook against her chest, working very hard not to come apart in a room full of strangers. Mason turned and looked at Amelia across the dining room. The board members, the cousins, the woman who had spent 2 weeks working to erase her. With the same direct attention, he had turned on her that first morning in the playroom. "She didn't make me speak. She made me feel safe." Enfield looked at the table. Lucas's cousin didn't pick up her glass. Celeste looked at Mason, at this 7-year-old who had just spoken more plainly than any adult in the room, and quietly looked away. "You'll leave the estate tonight," Lucas said to his mother. "You will have no further authority over Mason, his care, his schedule, or the people allowed in his life." He looked at Vanessa. "And Vanessa, you're terminated for altering evidence and using a child's trauma to protect your position." Vanessa picked up her blue notebook, set it back down, left it there. In Mrs. Hargrove's face, beneath the composure, something had begun. Not yet remorse, but the motion of a person beginning to reckon with the distance between protecting someone and controlling them. Mason walked back and stood beside Amelia, bear tucked under his arm, right hand open at his side. Not reaching, not demanding, just open. She reached down and took his hand. For the first time since she had walked into this house, she did not look at the floor. Even after the truth had been exposed in that dining room, Amelia didn't return the next morning. She needed a few days that belonged only to her. She spent Saturday reorganizing her sublet room in Somerville, 40 minutes of work, then sat on the fire escape with her notebook open and a cup of tea going cold. She didn't add anything. She just held it. Lucas came on Sunday. He drove himself. He brought an envelope. Mason's drawings, produced every day since she left. left each morning in a small pile on the kitchen counter that no one had touched because Mason had made clear, without a word, the pile was not for them. He kept drawing, every day. He didn't give them to anyone else. Amelia took the envelope. "There's coffee if you want it." They sat at the narrow kitchen table for 2 hours. Lucas apologized specifically. He had believed what he was shown instead of what he had seen. He had let his fear dress itself as certainty and chosen the version of events that made Amelia a threat, because the alternative required trusting something he couldn't control, and he had spent 3 years trying to control everything within reach of his son, and still failed. Amelia listened. Then she told him about Daniel. Not the facts, but the texture. What it was to grieve someone while they were still alive. To keep singing because it was the last thing that could reach him. He listened without steering, without looking for the exit. Just present, in a narrow kitchen, with both coffees going cold. When she agreed to come back, she said 3 things before letting him respond. "I'm not a tool for Mason to practice language with. I'm not a replacement for his mother. Not now, not ever. And I'm not someone for the Grant family to feel generous toward." A pause. "Those aren't the terms," Lucas said. "Then what are?" "You come when you're willing. You leave when you need to. We figure out the rest as we go." Not a complete answer, an honest one. She accepted it. The healing came slowly and without announcement. Some days Mason talked for 20 minutes, light through his bedroom window, which sounds reminded him of which feelings, what color he would make the sky. Other days, silence. Not the old locked kind, just the ordinary quiet of a child who didn't feel like talking. Nobody produced a tablet or a laminated card on those days. Amelia had made Mason's silence a condition of the work, and Lucas had agreed without hesitation. She worked with him 3 afternoons a week. Music, movement, the symbol system Mason had developed before she arrived, extended now into a private language with its own grammar. Words when he wanted them, symbols when he didn't. Drawings when even those were too much, and sometimes they just sat in the window seat and listened to the sounds the house made. Pipes, wind, the creak of the staircase at the 3rd step from the bottom. She told him all of it was language, that silence was too. Lucas learned to sit beside his son without needing anything back. He was not good at it in the beginning. He got better. Without announcement, Lucas arranged for Amelia's enrollment in the music education certification program at Northeastern to be reinstated, her prior credits intact, the remaining coursework fitted around her life. When he told her, "This isn't charity, it's what was owed to you before I knew your name," she didn't argue. On a Friday in late November, Mason pressed a folded piece of paper into her hands with more ceremony than usual. She opened it carefully. A crayon drawing. Lucas on the left, Mason at the center. In the upper right corner, a star. 2 lines of light descending at a gentle angle. Claire. Not absent, not lost, but above, still connected to the warmth below. On the right, drawn with more care than any of the others, Amelia, hands open, musical marks rising in the same radiating lines as the star's light. Below the composition, in the careful block letters Mason had been practicing alone, "Our Song." She thought about Daniel and the first night she had sung the lullaby. A hospital chair at 3 in the morning, his hand in hers, a melody made from nothing because she didn't know what else to give him. She had never imagined it would outlive him, never thought about what it might carry forward into a room she hadn't yet walked into. She cried. Mason climbed up beside her, put his head on her arm, and said nothing, which was exactly right. The Lullaby Healing Initiative was established through the Grant Foundation the following spring. Music-based therapeutic support at no cost for children in state care, pediatric trauma wards, and families who couldn't afford specialists. No press release. Built quietly and set running. Amelia led the pilot curriculum, the methodology she had been developing since Daniel's illness, now formalized, certified, available to other children in other cities. On the program materials, the core module was listed simply as the lullaby. No further explanation. The people who went through it understood. On an evening in December, the three of them were in Mason's room. Mason in the center of the window seat, Lucas on one side, Amelia on the other. Bear and sketchbook. Phone face down on his knee, which was how Amelia had learned to tell when Lucas was genuinely present. Outside, snow, the quiet, settling kind. Mason tilted his head against the window frame, then looked at Amelia. Say it again. She sang. The bars that had belonged to Claire, the bars that had always belonged to Daniel, and the new bars from this autumn that sounded like something continuing rather than something ending. Lucas closed his eyes. Outside, the snow came down without hurry. Inside, Mason had fallen asleep, his head on Amelia's arm, breathing slow and even and untroubled. Lucas looked at his son's face, then at Amelia. She was still singing, very quietly, past the end of the last bar. Not because the song required it, but because there was no particular reason to stop. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, if you've sat with Amelia through every room she wasn't supposed to matter in, with Mason through every silence he couldn't explain, and with Lucas through the long and imperfect work of learning to trust what he could see, then you already know this isn't really a story about a housekeeper and a CEO. It's about the moment someone who has been looked through is finally actually seen. It's about the things we carry quietly, the grief, the songs, the years we gave to someone we loved more than our own plans, and how those things sometimes turn out to be exactly what someone else has been waiting for. Leave us a comment and tell us who in your life has this kind of quiet strength. We read every single one, and we'll be back soon with another story.